Sauron never believed that his enemies would attempt to destroy the One Ring. Instead, he believed that they would use it against him, because it's what he would do. Throughout the War of the Ring, Sauron believed the One Ring to be in the hands of a hobbit named Baggins, then briefly in the hands of Saruman, and finally in the hands of Aragorn, which is why Aragorn's deception at the Black Gate worked so well. So in this video, we look at who might have been able to wield the One Ring effectively against Sauron, and how they might have done so. Before I get into the who, I do need to clarify how exactly one uses the One Ring. The primary use of the One Ring was to dominate others, but essentially, whilst the One Ring is a vast reservoir of power, its main effect is that it enhances the natural strength and abilities of the wearer. How much it enhances the wearer depends on the nature of the wearer itself, their spiritual strength, their vision and intentions regarding the use of the One Ring, and of course, how much they even know about the One Ring. For example, Gollum, a rather wretched and pathetic creature who was completely ignorant to the true nature of the One Ring, used it to commit dastardly deeds, and then became enslaved to it. Frodo, who was of much greater strength than Gollum, is described in Letter 246 as a brave man with a devastating weapon, but his problem is that he doesn't really know how to use it, and that he's naturally averse to violence. Characters like the bearers of the 3 Elven Rings, who are naturally powerful, know how the One Ring works and how to use it, would use it much in the same way that Sauron would use it. I'll talk more about that later. In the end, Tolkien envisioned there being 2 main ways that the One Ring could be used to defeat Sauron, and he gave us a pretty decent idea of who was capable of using the One Ring, and how they could actually use it. But keep in mind, despite these methods being valid ways of dealing with Sauron, the main issue is that the One Ring was a wholly evil artifact, and that even if you used it with good intentions in the beginning, eventually you would be corrupted by it, and would start using it for evil. This is the reason why characters such as Elrond and Gandalf opted for the option of destroying it. The first method of using the One Ring would be to overcome Sauron in a contest of wills. In other words, wrest control of the power in the One Ring from Sauron and make it your own. If someone managed to do this, the result for Sauron would have been his destruction, as he would be permanently separated from the bulk of his power, the same as if the One Ring was destroyed. However, all of the works associated with the One Ring, such as the Other Rings of Power or Barad-dûr, would have remained, and even with Sauron gone, the One Ring would have remained evil. It would not have been cleansed or anything. So who would be capable of doing this? Well, Tolkien didn't leave much to the imagination. He basically said that only Gandalf could have pulled this off with any certainty, and even then, it would have been a very tight contest. Gandalf at an advantage because he is actually wielding the One Ring, Gandalf at a disadvantage because the power doesn't actually belong to him, Sauron at an advantage because the power does belong to him, but at a disadvantage because he's not in possession of it, and also because he's been weakened due to millennia of exerting his will over others. Tolkien also points out that Galadriel might have stood a chance of supplanting Sauron in this manner, and by extension the wearers of the 3, Elrond and formerly Círdan. But Tolkien also points out that Galadriel's belief that she could replace Sauron in this way might stem from the delusions of grandeur that accompany the temptations of the One Ring. We see this occur with both Boromir and Sam. Strangely enough, Tolkien does not mention Saruman, despite earlier stating that the main reason why Gandalf could take on Sauron was because they were of the same order. An explanation for this is that Saruman had already fallen spiritually and was actually dominated by Sauron when they met through the Palantir. Basically, Saruman had already proven that he could not master the One Ring simply by being subservient to Sauron. So if Gandalf manages to master the One Ring and destroy Sauron, what happens next? Unfortunately, nothing good. This topic has been done to death, so I'll keep it brief using what Tolkien actually said. Basically, Gandalf would believe that he's being righteous, when in reality he would be being self-righteous. In pursuit of complete and total goodness, Gandalf would become tyrannical, and in doing so, would associate good with evil. This would make him worse than Sauron, as at least Sauron had the common decency to keep good and evil as clearly separate concepts. So when it comes to truly mastering the One Ring, Gandalf is the only real option. So what's the second way one could use the One Ring against Sauron? Well, even if you can't master the power within the One Ring, you can still use it. And as I said earlier, if you're powerful enough, you can use it to great effect. You could use it to defeat Sauron, not through replacing him, but through military means. As I said earlier, the primary power of the One Ring was to dominate others. Basically, you could dominate people into fighting against Sauron. This is how Boromir and presumably Denethor envision using the One Ring. In his confrontation with Frodo, Boromir goes on a rant talking about how the One Ring would give him the power of command, and that he could use it to raise mighty armies, form great alliances, and then overthrow Sauron, and he himself become a wise and benevolent king. The last part is the clear example of the delusion factor. He would not become a wise and benevolent king. But the part about raising armies to overthrow Sauron is true. Tolkien confirms it in Letter 246. He states that if Galadriel or Elrond could not master the One Ring, they could use it in the same way Sauron would. Quote, they would have built up an empire with great and absolutely subservient generals and armies and engines of war until they could challenge Sauron and destroy him by force. So, raising great armies, presumably many of them from Sauron's own subjects, and using them to overthrow Sauron. Who could have pulled this off? Well, we're not sure exactly because there's so many variables to factor in. A better question would be, who could make a reasonable attempt? Conceivably, anyone who had tangible physical strength or spiritual strength. But how well that attempt would go would differ greatly. In terms of men, characters like Faramir, Boromir, and Theoden probably wouldn't have too much success, for entirely different reasons. Faramir due to his goodness and a lack of desire to use it, Boromir due to his lack of wisdom and his pride, and Theoden due to his lack of self-belief. Denethor might go a bit better. He has the grim strength, the desire, and the wisdom, but much of his strength had already been spent in a contest of wills with Sauron through the Palantir. Of all men, Aragorn would probably do the best. He has the innate strength and willpower, he has the wisdom, he's an inspirational leader, he has the drive. Although, similar to Faramir, he would be reluctant to use the One Ring. Aragorn would have the best chance of marching on Mordor with armies at his back, and that's exactly why Sauron believed he had the One Ring. Why else would Aragorn come up with such an insane plan to march on the Black Gate with a mere 6,000 men? However, it's worth noting that, like with all mortals, Tolkien states that in any direct confrontation, regardless of whether Aragorn had the One Ring or not, he would be totally crushed by Sauron. The contest would be through military might, not a direct confrontation. As mentioned earlier, characters like Elrond, Galadriel, and Círdan would also be capable of doing this, likely with more success than any mortal man. You could probably also add Glorfindel and Celeborn to this list, and maybe even Thranduil. But someone who certainly wanted and needed the One Ring to overthrow Sauron was Saruman. Saruman played both sides, and ultimately ended up in a position where he needed the One Ring. Without it, Isengard would stand no chance against Mordor. But with the One Ring, Saruman would prove a very formidable foe. The power of his voice was already substantial, and that would only be enhanced by the power of the One Ring. If there was anyone capable of turning Sauron's own armies against him, it was Saruman. Alright, so you could argue that using the One Ring against Sauron in this manner is far less risky than sending it into Mordor to be destroyed. But once again, the issue is that it doesn't solve the problem of evil at all. It might not even solve the problem of Sauron. The reality is that anyone who uses the One Ring in this fashion would still inevitably end up being corrupted, and would become a tyrant. As Galadriel says, instead of a Dark Lord, you will have a queen. In the case of a mortal man bearing the One Ring, they would eventually become a wraith, and in that case, who knows where the One Ring would end up. There's also the potential problem of Sauron himself. Given enough time, the bearer, provided they aren't a mortal man, might eventually be able to master the One Ring. But if not, even if Sauron is defeated and even killed, there's a possibility that he might keep reforming and returning. After all, the existence of the One Ring is what allowed for this multiple times, given it contains the majority of his power. This might result in a rather ironic scenario of Sauron arising again as a symbol of resistance against the tyranny of someone like Galadriel or Saruman. I hope that by this point in the video, you've now realised why the One Ring being destroyed was really the only option. The other options, even if successful, would simply result in Sauron being replaced. At first, it might not be so bad, but eventually, it would be just as bad, if not worse. If unsuccessful, it would have merely delayed the inevitable of Sauron ending up as Master of Middle-earth. Destroying the One Ring was an all-or-nothing option, but it was the only way to deal with Sauron permanently, and to make sure that nothing similar would ever rise to replace him. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you're interested in reading Tolkien's own words about this subject, I direct you to letter 246 from the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's where much of the information in this video was sourced from, and it's a really interesting read. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the One Ring is at its most powerful when you use it as a